Numbers, numbers, numbers. In this fast-moving world with its fast-moving data, we don't and probably shouldn't trust the media. It's always hard to know whether you're receiving all of the information at any given time. And so we're told to go look at different sources for the complete story. But again, it's a fast-moving world, and who has time for that? But in the midst of this confusion, we have a godsend: data. Theories and stories are always more reliable when they're backed with data, studies and polls and numbers. Numbers that always make us go like, yeah, that sounds right. But did you know 73.5% of data is faulty? Just kidding, it's not. But I'm sure you fell for that in the last few seconds. The point is, 73.5% or not, there is a lot of misrepresented data, incomplete data, and biased data everywhere around us. In politics, in healthcare, in the news, and in science. Wait, what? But you're probably still going like, okay, scientists have let me down big time. But how is it my problem? Because in this world, we make our decisions, from small decisions like which restaurant to eat dinner at, to big decisions like maybe navigating the whole of the COVID crisis, on data. Not even just us as individuals, but as companies and governments. And that's why we need to have quick, efficient methods to weed out the bad data from the good. And that's what this episode is about. Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the What About the World podcast. This podcast is for the curious people that want to know more, understand more, and most importantly, question more. This episode, we're talking about how statistics lie and how to spot them. Let's start with a story from World War II. This story is about a Hungarian wartime mathematician, Abraham Wald. One day, a few generals came up to him with a problem that they needed solved. They wanted to know how heavy the armor on the planes should be to prevent them from getting hit by bullets. Wald asked what parts of the plane they'd be applying armor to, and the generals handed him a sheet with the data table of the bullet holes on each of the planes that came back. They were planning on applying armor to whatever place got hit with the most bullets. Sounds logical, right? Well, to Wald it was not. He said that they were applying armor to the wrong places. These generals had made the same assumption that we so often make. They didn't look at where the data itself was coming from. The data table they had shown him was of the planes that had come back, not the ones that had gone down in a fight. That meant that these places where these bullet holes were the places a plane could sustain injury. They should instead put armor where there were no bullet holes at all, because that meant the plane did not come back. And that, my friends, is called survivorship bias. But instead of getting into that theory, and you can definitely search it up on Google, the theory is actually very interesting. I've used this story as a way to show you how gathering information, how you gather it, what information you gather, and where it comes from, is very central to understanding the information truthfully. So, questions to always ask yourself when faced with studies or polls of any kind is, what was the sample size? Was there selection bias involved? And what is the data already assuming? Also, always take polls with a grain of salt, because they can do all of these things in a very tricky manner. There's a lot of ways to misrepresent polls. You can choose a small sample size, a biased sample size, or you can use suggestive questions to lead the takers of the poll in a specific direction. Okay, so we've understood how to carefully look at what the numbers are. But even if the information gathered is very thoroughly understood, it's still possible to misinterpret it. For example, take the relationship between causation and correlation. To explain these two terms, let's get into a little bit of math for a bit. If X noticeably increases when Y increases and decreases when Y decreases, we call these two positively correlated. Now, if one increases while the other decreases, they are called negatively correlated. But why does this happen? There are 4 different possible answers to this question. X causes Y causes X, or a third factor causes both X and Y, or, besides all of that this is a coincidence. Too often, causation, X causes Y and Y causes X, gets mixed up with the last two options, a third factor or a coincidence. For example, if the number of ice creams sold goes up in the month of June, and the number of bear attacks also goes up that month, can we say the greater number of ice creams sold results in a greater number of bear attacks? No, not really. And mixing up causation and correlation often leads to conclusions that are very misinformed, like we just saw with the ice creams and the bears, even if they're like quote unquote backed by data. In fact, this happens all the time in the stock market, in lawmaking, in daily life, and in, well, science. Sorry, scientists, it looks like I'm after your credibility today. In fact, journalists also do this a lot because their incentive to bring up data is to sell, and no one wants to buy the same news that they bought last year. So, journalists sometimes use something called amplification phenomenon. They impress upon correlations and causations that may not be, in fact, related in an important way. So always ask yourself if the point the author of the data is trying to make makes sense. If it's some kind of new, unconventional news kind of data, be cautious around it. There are even technologies like PolitiFact, a website that detects political truths and lies, with data or without data, that can help spot these mix-ups in the processing of the data itself. So now we've looked at gathering the data and processing the data. What comes next? Displaying the data, of course. This might actually be my favorite part. The amount of crazy graphs you'll see online with the most obvious intentions to propel propaganda is hilarious. Actually, Fox News is famous for misrepresenting data. One time during elections, they wanted to show the percent of people that were voting for each candidate. They showed it as a pie graph. And if all these percentages were added, they'd provide you with a percent greater than 100 on a pie graph. That's great, right? In fact, a professor at Columbia University, Bill Gruskin, actually has a whole Twitter account on all the flawed data that news channel pulls up. And obviously, Fox News isn't the only news to do this. If you see enough misrepresented graphs, you usually know how to spot them. I think the best thing to do with spotting these kind of faults is to search up faulty graphs on Google and just look at them. No, really, it helps. There's a lot of commonalities between misrepresented graphs. Notice that many of them might not have labels, their y-axis starts at a different point than 0, they have strategic increments, and many times they purposely don't use the appropriate kind of graph to represent the situation. Now, I think we've covered all the bases. Gathering, processing, displaying. I'd say congrats on your start to data literacy. And as I've said before, in today's day, it's important to be educated about data. That's something we often miss out on, and we shouldn't. In today's world, it is just as important to be educated about accurate data as it is to be warned about false news or digital citizenship or the dangers of cyberspace. Information is powerful, and there is no purer form of information than data. With that is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and tune in for the next episode next month. Don't forget to recommend it to friends and family.
Don't wanna talk about the world, don't wanna talk about life with nuance.